The Ferrari Testarossa sat silent in the Beverly Hills garage, its red paint gleaming under the auction lights like a beautiful corpse. Sophia Winters adjusted her black cocktail dress and smiled coldly as Derek Matthews leaned against the hood, his Rolex catching the light as he gestured expansively about his connections in the automotive world. She'd heard this type of boasting from dozens of men before. All talk, no substance. The 1985 Testarossa hadn't run in 5 years, despite visits from the city's most expensive mechanics. Such a shame, Derek continued, running his manicured finger along the car's curves. A masterpiece like this deserves better than sitting as decoration. Sophia's lips curved into a dangerous smile. The charity auction buzzed around them, but her focus narrowed to this moment, this challenge, this beautiful opportunity to watch another peacock's feathers fall. "If you fix this engine, I'll marry you," she said, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The laughter that followed Sophia's declaration rippled through the crowd like champagne bubbles breaking the surface. Derek's chest puffed with the kind of confidence that comes from never being truly tested. He straightened his designer tie and flashed that practiced smile that had closed countless real estate deals across Los Angeles. The other guests whispered behind their wine glasses, already placing mental bets on how quickly the pretty boy would back down from the challenge. Sophia Winters had built her venture capital empire on reading people's tells, and Derek Matthews was an open book written in large print. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when she mentioned the engine, and his eyes darted toward the Testarossa's hood with the nervous energy of a man who'd just realized he might have bitten off more than he could chew. But pride, that most dangerous of human weaknesses, had already wrapped its fingers around his throat. "You're serious?" Derek said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that he tried to mask with amusement. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing blood in the water. This was Beverly Hills entertainment at its finest, watching the wealthy and powerful play their games of ego and consequence. Sophia nodded slowly, her dark eyes never leaving his face. She'd inherited more than just money from her grandfather, Anthony Winters. She'd inherited his ability to spot a bluff from across a poker table. "Dead serious. That car has been sitting here for 5 years. 3 different Ferrari specialists have declared it unfixable. The engine seized up completely after someone tried to hot rod the electronics." She paused, letting the weight of the challenge settle on Derek's shoulders like a lead blanket. "But I'm sure a man with your connections won't have any trouble with a little Italian engineering." The trap was set, baited with Derek's own arrogance and witnessed by half of LA's social elite. He couldn't back down now without losing face. And losing face in this crowd was social suicide. Derek's smile became strained around the edges, but he extended his hand toward Sophia with theatrical confidence. "You've got yourself a deal, Ms. Winters. How long do I have?" "1 month," Sophia replied, shaking his hand with a grip that spoke of her grandfather's lessons about never showing weakness. "The car doesn't move from this garage until it's running perfectly. And Derek?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "I'll know if you're trying to pull any tricks." As the crowd dispersed and the evening wound down, Derek found himself standing alone with the silent Ferrari, its red paint now seeming to mock him under the fluorescent lights. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. He needed help, and he needed it fast. But finding someone skilled enough to resurrect a dead Testarossa and desperate enough to work in secret would require calling in favors he'd rather keep in reserve. 30 miles away in a modest garage tucked between a laundromat and a taco shop, Jack Harrison wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and looked up at the clock. Nearly midnight, and he was still working on Mrs. Chen's ancient Honda Civic. The transmission rebuild should have been finished hours ago, but perfectionism was both his blessing and his curse. Every bolt had to be exactly right, every gasket perfectly sealed. It was the same obsessive attention to detail that had once made him the most sought-after race mechanic on the NASCAR circuit, before everything fell apart. 12-year-old Tyler sat on a nearby stool, supposedly doing homework, but actually watching his father work with the kind of fascination that only comes from genuine love. The boy had inherited Jack's mechanical intuition, along with his dark hair and quiet intensity. "Dad, why don't you ever talk about the racing days?" Tyler asked, not for the first time. Jack's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "Some stories are better left buried, son. Help me with this transmission mount." It was the same deflection Tyler had heard 100 times before. But tonight, something in his father's voice suggested the buried stories were fighting their way to the surface. The garage was Jack's sanctuary, filled with the honest smell of motor oil and the satisfying weight of real tools in capable hands. Here, surrounded by engines that responded to skill rather than politics, he could almost forget about the scandal that had destroyed his reputation and driven him into exile from the sport he'd loved since childhood. Almost, but never completely. The phone rang, startling both father and son. Jack frowned as he glanced at the caller ID. Unknown number, Los Angeles area code. Legitimate customers didn't usually call after midnight. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Harrison's garage," Jack said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd learned to expect the worst from unexpected phone calls. Derek Matthews' voice came through the speaker with the kind of desperate confidence that immediately put Jack on guard. "I heard you're the guy to call when everyone else says it's impossible. I've got a job that could be very profitable for the right person." Jack had heard pitches like this before, usually from people who wanted corners cut or questions left unasked. Depends on the job. What kind of car are we talking about? 1985 Ferrari Testarossa. Engines completely seized. Previous mechanics said it's unfixable. Derek's voice carried the particular brand of desperation that comes from a man who's promised more than he can deliver. "I need it running perfectly in 4 weeks, and I need absolute discretion." The mention of the Testarossa made Jack's pulse quicken despite himself. Those cars were mechanical poetry, Italian engineering at its finest. But the request for discretion raised red flags that years of hard experience had taught him never to ignore. "Why the secrecy? And why call me? There are plenty of Ferrari specialists in LA with better reputations." Derek's laugh held no humor. "Let's just say this is more about getting results than following conventional procedures. The pay is $15,000 cash, no questions asked. All I need is for the car to run perfectly for 1 day." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. $15,000 would cover Tyler's tuition at the private school with the excellent engineering program, with enough left over to finally fix the garage's leaking roof. It was more money than Jack typically made in 3 months of honest work. But honest work had become his religion since the racing scandal, the only thing standing between him and the bitter cynicism that had claimed so many of his former colleagues. "I don't work under the table," Jack said finally. "Everything I do is above board, properly documented and guaranteed. If that's not what you're looking for, you're calling the wrong guy." There was a long pause on Derek's end, the sound of a man calculating risks and finding all his options lacking. "The work itself is completely legitimate. It's just, there are some ego issues involved. Look, can we meet tomorrow? Let you take a look at the car and decide for yourself?" Tyler was watching his father with sharp eyes, clearly picking up on the tension in the conversation. Jack found himself thinking about the boys' college fund, or rather the lack thereof. Private school tuition, car repairs, groceries. The bills never stopped coming, and the garage barely broke even most months. "Where's the car?" Jack asked, already knowing he was about to make a decision he might regret. Beverly Hills, classic car storage facility, very professional setup. Derek's voice carried renewed hope. Can you be there tomorrow afternoon? 2 o'clock? Jack looked around his small garage at the peeling paint and ancient equipment that somehow still got the job done. Then he looked at Tyler, brilliant and curious and deserving of every opportunity Jack could provide. I'll be there, but I'm not promising anything until I see what we're dealing with. After hanging up, Jack sat in the silence of his garage, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic on the freeway. Tyler had gone back to his homework, but Jack could feel the boy's attention like a weight on his shoulders. Dad? Tyler's voice was carefully casual. Is everything okay? Jack forced a smile and ruffled his son's hair. Just a potential job, kiddo. Nothing to worry about. But as he said the words, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and tomorrow's meeting would determine whether he found solid ground or took a very long fall. The next afternoon found Jack driving his battered pickup truck through the manicured streets of Beverly Hills, feeling like an oil stain on white silk. The storage facility was everything Derek had promised: climate-controlled, security cameras, and the kind of pristine organization that spoke of serious money. But it was the Ferrari Testarossa that stole Jack's attention the moment he laid eyes on it. The car sat under custom lighting like a sculpture in a museum, its red paint deeper and richer than anything Jack had seen in years. This wasn't just any Testarossa. This was one of the early models, probably worth more than Jack's house and garage combined. But even from across the room, he could see the telltale signs of an engine that had died hard. Derek appeared at his elbow, nervous energy radiating from every gesture. Beautiful, isn't it? Shame it's been sitting dead for so long. He was trying to sound casual, but Jack could hear the desperation underneath. Jack walked slowly around the Ferrari, his trained eye cataloguing details that would be invisible to most people. The slight discoloration around the hood vents, the way the car sat just a fraction too low in the front, the faint smell of burnt electronics that still lingered after 5 years. This wasn't just a seized engine. This was a mechanical disaster that someone had tried and failed to cover up. Mind if I pop the hood? Jack asked, though he was already reaching for the release. What he found under the hood made him whistle low under his breath. The engine bay was a testament to expensive mistakes. Aftermarket electronics jury-rigged into factory systems, custom wiring that looked like it had been installed by someone with more ambition than skill, and clear evidence that someone had tried to modify the fuel injection system without understanding the consequences. Jesus, Jack muttered, running his fingers along a melted wiring harness. What did they do to this poor car? Derek shifted uncomfortably. Previous owner tried to modernize some of the systems. Things got complicated. Jack looked up from the engine bay, his expression carefully neutral. Derek, this isn't just a seized engine. This is a complete electrical nightmare wrapped around mechanical trauma. Whoever worked on this car before turned it into a very expensive paperweight. He paused, letting the reality sink in. It's going to take a lot more than 4 weeks to bring this back to life. The desperation in Derek's eyes became impossible to hide. How long are we talking? And what would it cost? Jack did quick mental calculations, factoring in parts, labor, and the sheer complexity of undoing years of mechanical abuse. 6 months minimum, assuming we can even find replacement parts for some of this custom work. Cost-wise, you're looking at $30,000 to $40,000. Easy. Derek's face went pale. That's impossible. I need it running in 4 weeks, and I can't spend more than $20,000. His voice cracked slightly on the numbers. Jack straightened up and wiped his hands on his jeans. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd learned to walk away from. Unrealistic expectations, impossible deadlines, and a client who was clearly in over his head. Then you need to find someone else. I don't do miracle work, and I won't take your money knowing I can't deliver what you need. Wait. Derek's voice carried the sharp edge of panic. What if I told you this was just about getting the engine to turn over? It doesn't have to run perfectly. It just has to start and idle for maybe 10 minutes. Jack paused, his hand on the Ferrari's fender. There was something in Derek's tone that suggested this wasn't really about the car at all. Why? What happens in 10 minutes? Derek's composure finally cracked completely. Look, I made a stupid bet with someone who has a lot more money and power than I do. If I can't get this car running, I'm going to lose a lot more than just money. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair. I'll pay you $25,000 cash if you can just get it to start. That's all I need. $25,000. The number hit Jack like a physical blow. It was more money than he'd seen at one time since his racing days. Enough to secure Tyler's future and maybe even start rebuilding the reputation he'd lost. But the desperation in Derek's voice, the emphasis on secrecy, the unrealistic timeline, everything about the situation screamed trouble. Jack found himself thinking about Tyler's face when he'd mentioned the engineering program at the private school, the way the boy's eyes had lit up with possibility before reality set in. Sometimes being a good father meant taking calculated risks, even when every instinct screamed to walk away. I'll need to see the car every day, full access to order whatever parts I need, and a deposit up front. Jack said finally. And Derek? If this is some kind of scam or illegal activity, I'm out immediately. I won't risk my son's future for anyone. Derek's relief was palpable. It's completely legitimate, I swear. Just a matter of pride and reputation. He pulled out his wallet and counted out $5,000 in hundreds. Down payment, the rest when the car starts. As Jack pocketed the money, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed a contract with the devil. But Tyler's college fund had just gotten its first major contribution, and sometimes that had to be enough to quiet the voice of caution whispering in the back of his mind. The real work began the next morning. Jack arrived at the storage facility before dawn, armed with a toolbox that had seen him through countless racing seasons and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The Ferrari waited under its lights, beautiful and broken, and challenging him to work miracles he wasn't sure he could deliver. The first step was archaeological, carefully removing years of failed modifications to reveal the original engine underneath. Each component had to be catalogued, cleaned, and evaluated for damage. Some parts were salvageable, others were complete losses that would need replacement or custom fabrication. By the end of the first week, Jack had filled 3 garbage bags with destroyed components and compiled a list of replacement parts that read like a Ferrari museum's wish list. The engine block itself was in better shape than he'd initially feared, but the electronics were a complete disaster that would need to be rebuilt from scratch. It was during the second week that Jack first noticed he was being watched. The woman appeared on Tuesday, standing in the observation area that overlooked the garage floor. She was elegant in that particular way that spoke of serious money. Not flashy or obvious, but unmistakably expensive. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that probably cost more than Jack made in a week, and she watched his work with the kind of intense focus that made him uncomfortable. "Can I help you?" Jack called out during a break, wiping his hands on a shop towel. She smiled, and for a moment Jack forgot about the Ferrari entirely. "Just admiring the craftsmanship. It's not often you see someone who really understands these old cars." There was something in her voice that suggested she knew more about cars than most people, and definitely more than her appearance would suggest. "You're familiar with Ferraris?" Jack asked. "My grandfather was something of a collector. He always said that these cars were more art than machine, that they required a special touch to bring out their true potential. She stepped closer to the barrier separating the work area from the observation space. "I'm Catherine, by the way, but most people call me Kate." Jack introduced himself, though something about the way she said her name suggested it wasn't complete truth. There was a formality to it, like she was playing a role. "Your grandfather had good taste? These Testarossas are incredible machines when they're running properly." Kate's eyes moved over the partially disassembled engine with obvious knowledge. "That's a lot of custom work someone tried to do. Probably made things worse instead of better." "You could say that?" Jack was impressed despite himself. Most people looked at an engine and saw a mechanical mystery. Kate was clearly seeing the same problems he'd identified. "Are you in the automotive business?" "Not exactly, but I've spent enough time around mechanics to recognize quality work when I see it." She paused, studying his face with uncomfortable intensity. "You're very good at this. I can tell just from watching you handle the components." There was something about the compliment that felt loaded, like she was testing him or leading toward something. Jack had learned to be wary of people who showed up uninvited and asked too many questions. "Just trying to get the job done. The owner is pretty anxious to get it running again." Kate's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing her features. "Yes, I imagine he is. Well, I should let you get back to work. It was nice meeting you, Jack." She left as quietly as she'd arrived, but Jack found himself thinking about her for the rest of the day. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. And the way she'd looked at the Ferrari, not like someone admiring a pretty car, but like someone seeing an old friend. The third week brought both breakthrough and complication. Jack had finally traced the source of the electrical problems to a cascading failure in the fuel management system, and he'd managed to source most of the replacement parts through his network of contacts in the racing world. The engine was starting to look like something that might actually run again. But Derek was becoming increasingly anxious, calling multiple times a day for progress reports and showing up at the garage with the jittery energy of a man running out of time. "How much longer?" became his constant refrain, usually followed by increasingly desperate offers to pay more money for faster results. "These things take time," Jack would tell him over and over. "You can't rush precision work. One mistake now and we're back to square one." It was during one of these conversations that Kate reappeared, this time carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive and official. Derek's reaction to seeing her was immediate and uncomfortable. His face went pale, and he actually took a step backward. "Ms. Winters," Derek said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Winters. The name hit Jack like a slap, and suddenly Kate's familiarity made perfect sense. He'd seen her face in business magazines, usually accompanying articles about successful venture capitalists or charitable foundations. Catherine Winters, though most people knew her as Sophia Winters, CEO and heir to the Winters fortune. "I wanted to check on the progress," Sophia said, her tone pleasant, but carrying an undertone that suggested checking on progress was the least of her concerns. "After all, I do have a vested interest in whether this car runs again." Derek looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Everything's going according to plan. Jack here is doing excellent work." Jack found himself caught in the middle of whatever game was being played between these two people. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a wrench, and he was beginning to understand that his involvement in this project went far deeper than simply fixing an engine. "Actually," Sophia continued, her eyes moving between Derek and Jack, "I've been doing some research on automotive restoration, and I've learned some very interesting things about proper procedures and timelines." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a stack of papers. "For instance, I've discovered that a complete restoration of a 1985 Testarossa with this level of damage should take at least 6 months and cost significantly more than $25,000. The number hit Jack like cold water. How did she know exactly what Derek was paying him? And more importantly, what else did she know about this arrangement? Derek's composure finally cracked completely. Look, Sophia, I can explain everything. This isn't what it looks like. Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, Sophia replied, her voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze helium. The question is whether Jack here knows what he's gotten himself into. Jack set down his tools and looked back and forth between them, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a picture he didn't like. Would someone mind telling me what's really going on here? Because I'm starting to feel like I walked into the middle of a movie without reading the script. Sophia's expression softened slightly as she looked at him. Jack, did Derek tell you why he needs this car running? Did he mention the circumstances that led to this arrangement? He said it was about pride and reputation, Jack said slowly. Some kind of bet or challenge. That's one way to put it. Sophia's smile held no warmth as she looked at Derek. What he didn't tell you is that I own this car. It belonged to my grandfather, and Derek here made a rather foolish promise about fixing it himself. The timeline he gave you isn't arbitrary. It's the deadline for a very public commitment he made in front of half of Beverly Hills. The full scope of Derek's deception was beginning to dawn on Jack. This wasn't just about mechanical work. This was about fraud, about taking credit for someone else's expertise, about using Jack's skills to win a bet Derek had no business making. And, Sophia continued, what makes this particularly interesting is that Derek led everyone to believe he would be doing the work himself. Using your skills to fulfill his promise is essentially cheating, wouldn't you say? Jack felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the full implications hit him. He'd been played, used as a pawn in someone else's game of ego and deception. The $25,000 that had seemed like salvation now felt like blood money, tainted by lies he'd never agreed to be part of. I didn't know, Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just realized he'd compromised his principles for money. Derek told me this was legitimate work, no questions asked. Sophia's expression softened as she looked at him. I know you didn't. I've been watching you work, and I can see the integrity in everything you do, the way you handle each component, the care you take with every detail. That's not the work of someone trying to deceive anyone. Derek finally found his voice, desperation making it crack around the edges. Look, this doesn't have to be complicated. Jack, you finish the job, I pay you, everyone goes home happy. Sophia, you get your car back running like new. Where's the harm in that? The harm, Sophia said, her voice dropping to Arctic temperatures, is that you made a promise you couldn't keep, and now you're asking this man to sacrifice his reputation to save yours. She turned to Jack, her eyes holding a mixture of respect and something that might have been regret. Jack, did Derek tell you why this car is so important to me? Jack shook his head, though pieces were beginning to form a picture he was afraid to complete. This Testarossa belonged to my grandfather, Anthony Winters. He was something of a legend in the racing world back in the 1970s and 80s. Sophia's voice took on a softer quality, memory tempering her anger. He died 5 years ago, and this car was his pride and joy. It stopped running the day after his funeral, like it was mourning him too. The name Anthony Winters hit Jack like a physical blow. Every mechanic who'd ever worked in racing knew that name. Anthony Winters had owned one of the most successful racing teams in NASCAR history, known for his integrity, his loyalty to his crew, and his absolute refusal to tolerate cheating in any form. You knew him, Sophia said, watching Jack's face. I can see it in your expression. Jack nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotions he'd buried for years. I worked for his team briefly back in 2014. Just for a few months, but he was everything they said about him. Honest, demanding, fair. Jack paused, the weight of old memories pressing down on him. He fired me when the scandal broke, said he couldn't afford to have anyone on his team who might compromise the integrity of the sport. What scandal? Sophia asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Jack looked down at his oil-stained hands, hands that had once been trusted with million-dollar race cars and now struggled to keep a small garage afloat. 2014. Someone was feeding information about our car setups to a rival team. When they couldn't find the real source, they needed a scapegoat. I was the newest guy on the crew, didn't have the connections to fight back. His voice grew quieter. Your grandfather didn't want to let me go, but the evidence looked pretty convincing. Even I wasn't sure I was innocent for a while. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the garage's ventilation system. Derek shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of his depth, in a conversation about integrity and consequences. But you were innocent, Sophia said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Took them 3 years to catch the real guy, one of the senior mechanics who'd been with the team for over a decade. By then, my reputation was shot, and nobody in racing would touch me. Jack managed a bitter smile. Turns out being right doesn't always matter if you can't prove it when it counts. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, studying Jack's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of decision. Jack, I want to make you an offer. Forget about Derek's arrangement. Work directly for me. Take as long as you need to restore this car properly. Do it right. And I'll pay you $50,000 plus all expenses. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. $50,000 would solve every financial problem Jack faced, would secure Tyler's future, would maybe even allow him to start rebuilding the reputation he'd lost. But there was something in Sophia's tone that suggested this was about more than just fixing a car. Derek's face had gone white. Sophia, you can't do this. We had a deal. Our deal was that if you fixed my grandfather's car, I would marry you, Sophia replied, her voice carrying the sharp edge of absolute finality. Since you clearly can't fix it yourself, our deal is void. But the car will be running. That's what matters. No, Derek. What matters is honesty. What matters is integrity. What matters is not taking credit for someone else's work. Sophia's eyes never left Jack's face as she continued. My grandfather spent his entire career fighting against people like you. People who thought they could shortcut their way to success by using other people's talents. Jack found himself at a crossroads that felt familiar and terrifying. Accept Sophia's offer, and he'd be financially secure, but he'd also be abandoning a commitment he'd already made. Honor his agreement with Derek, and he'd be participating in a deception that went against everything he'd tried to rebuild about himself. I need some time to think about this, Jack said finally. Derek's desperation reached a new peak. Time? Jack, I'm offering you $25,000 for 3 weeks of work. That's more money than you'll see in the next 6 months working on rust buckets and oil changes. Money isn't everything, Jack replied, but even as he said it, he thought about Tyler's college fund and the garage's mounting bills. Sophia stepped closer, her voice dropping to a more personal register. Jack, let me ask you something. When you work on an engine, when you solve a mechanical problem that nobody else could figure out, how does that feel? The question caught Jack off guard. It feels right, like I'm doing what I was meant to do. And when you take shortcuts, when you compromise on quality to meet a deadline? Jack's jaw tightened. It feels like betraying everything I believe in. Then you already know what the right choice is. Sophia's smile was sad, but genuine. The question is whether you're brave enough to make it. Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. Tyler's school, asking about the tuition payment that was now 2 weeks overdue. The timing felt like the universe playing a cruel joke, reminding him exactly what was at stake. "I'll give you until tomorrow morning to decide," Sophia said, gathering her papers. "But Jack, whatever you choose, I want you to know that I respect the work you've done here. You've brought this car closer to running than anyone has in 5 years. That takes real skill." As she walked away, Derek immediately cornered Jack, his voice tight with panic. "You can't seriously be considering her offer. Look, I'll make it $30,000. Cash, if you stick with our original deal. Just get the car running by Friday and walk away." Jack looked at the partially restored Ferrari, at the hours of careful work he'd invested in bringing it back to life. Each component had been cleaned, calibrated, and installed with the same precision he'd once brought to race cars worth millions of dollars. The work was good. Honest and skilled, and something he could be proud of. But pride didn't pay tuition bills or keep the lights on in the garage. "I'll let you know tomorrow," Jack said, though part of him already knew what his answer would have to be. That night, Jack sat in his kitchen across from Tyler, picking at a dinner of leftover pizza and wrestling with a decision that felt bigger than just fixing a car. The boy was working on calculus homework with the kind of intense focus that reminded Jack painfully of himself at that age, back when the future had seemed full of unlimited possibilities. "Dad?" Tyler looked up from his textbook. "You've been really quiet tonight. Everything okay?" Jack studied his son's face, seeing echoes of his own features mixed with memories of Sarah, Tyler's mother who'd died when the boy was only 3. Tyler was brilliant, curious, and deserving of every opportunity the world could offer. But opportunities cost money, and Jack's principles were expensive luxuries he might not be able to afford. "Just thinking about work stuff, kiddo. Nothing for you to worry about." Tyler set down his pencil and gave Jack the kind of look that suggested he wasn't fooled by the deflection. "Is it about that Ferrari? You've been working on it for weeks, but you never talk about it like you do other cars." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Tyler was right. Jack usually loved talking about interesting mechanical challenges, but the Testarossa had become a source of stress rather than excitement. "It's complicated," Jack said finally. "Sometimes in business, people want things that aren't quite right, and you have to decide whether the money is worth compromising what you believe in." Tyler considered this with the seriousness that 12-year-olds bring to matters they sense are important. What would Mom have said? The question hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Sarah had been the moral compass of their small family, the one who'd always pushed Jack to do the right thing even when the right thing was difficult. She would have hated seeing him struggle with this decision. She would have said that integrity is the only thing you really own, and once you sell it, you can never really buy it back, Jack said quietly. Then why is this complicated? Jack looked around their small kitchen, at the overdue bills stacked on the counter and the college brochures Tyler had been collecting. How could he explain to a 12-year-old that sometimes being a good father meant making choices that didn't feel good? Because sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you can afford, Jack said. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the table and put his hand on Jack's arm. "Dad, remember when Mrs. Peterson wanted you to lie about her car passing inspection? You said no, even though we really needed the money." Jack remembered. It had been last winter, and they'd been behind on the heating bill. Peterson had offered him $500 to sign off on safety inspection for a car that had dangerous brake problems. It would have been easy money, and nobody would have been the wiser until something went wrong. "That was different," Jack said. "Someone could have gotten hurt." "How is this different?" Tyler asked, with the devastating logic of youth. Jack didn't have a good answer, and they both knew it. The next morning dawned grey and cold, matching Jack's mood as he drove toward the storage facility. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to find a solution that didn't exist. By the time he arrived at the garage, he'd made his decision, though it sat in his stomach like a stone. Derek was waiting for him, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Well, have you thought about my offer?" "Yeah, I've thought about it." Jack looked at the Ferrari, beautiful and almost ready to run again. 3 more days of work, maybe 4, and the engine would purr like it had when Anthony Winters first drove it off the showroom floor. "I can't do it, Derek. Find someone else." Derek's face went through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly grey. "You can't be serious. I'm offering you $30,000, and I'm telling you it's not enough." Jack began packing his tools, each one carefully placed in its designated spot in the toolbox that had been his companion through years of honest work. "Find another mechanic. Tell Sophia the truth, or figure out how to fix it yourself. But I'm done being part of whatever game you're playing." "Game?" Derek's voice cracked with desperation. "This isn't a game. If I don't deliver on this promise, I'm finished in this town. My reputation, my business, everything I've worked for, it's all gone." Jack paused in his packing, struck by the parallel between Derek's situation and his own scandal years earlier. But there was a crucial difference. Derek had created his own mess through arrogance and deception, while Jack had been an innocent victim of someone else's crimes. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you made promises you couldn't keep," Jack said quietly. Derek's desperation turned to anger. "Fine, walk away, but don't expect to get any referrals from me, and don't expect this town to forget that Jack Harrison is the kind of mechanic who abandons jobs when things get complicated." The threat hung in the air like exhaust fumes, toxic and lingering. Jack had heard similar words before, during the racing scandal, from people who'd rather destroy his reputation than admit their own mistakes. "Let me tell you something, Derek," Jack said, turning to face the younger man. "I've had my reputation destroyed once by people who cared more about protecting themselves than telling the truth. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it cost me everything I'd worked for." He picked up his toolbox, its familiar weight grounding him in his decision. "But you know what I learned? A reputation built on lies isn't worth protecting, and money earned through deception always comes with a price you can't afford to pay." As Jack walked toward the exit, Derek called after him one last time. "40,000! That's my final offer!" Jack didn't look back. He was loading his tools into the truck when Sophia appeared, emerging from a sleek, black sedan with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never doubted she belonged exactly where she was. "Leaving?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Derek can find someone else to help him cheat his way out of the hole he dug for himself," Jack replied. "I'm done being part of this circus." Sophia nodded approvingly. "Good. That means my offer is still on the table. 50,000 to restore the car properly, no shortcuts, no deadlines except the ones that make sense mechanically." Jack looked at her, this woman who'd inherited more money than he'd ever see in a lifetime, offering him a fortune to do work he'd love doing anyway. It should have been an easy yes, but something in her expression suggested there were complications he hadn't considered. "Why?" he asked. "You could hire any specialist in the country for that kind of money. Why offer it to a small-town mechanic with a damaged reputation?" Sophia was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving to the storage facility where the Ferrari waited. "Because 3 years ago, I hired a private investigator to look into the racing scandal that destroyed your career. I wanted to know if my grandfather had made the right decision in letting you go." Jack's blood went cold. And I learned that Anthony Winters spent the last 2 years of his life regretting that decision. He knew you were innocent, Jack. He'd figured out who the real culprit was, but by then it was too late to undo the damage to your reputation. Sophia's voice carried a weight of old regret. My grandfather died believing he'd failed one of the best mechanics he'd ever worked with. The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. All these years he'd carried the pain of disappointment from a man he'd respected above all others, never knowing that Anthony Winters had eventually learned the truth. He left something for you, Sophia continued, reaching into her purse. A letter. He made me promise to deliver it if I ever found you. The envelope was heavy stock paper, expensive and formal, with Jack's name written in the careful script of a man who'd learned penmanship before computers existed. Jack's hands shook slightly as he opened it. The letter was brief, but every word carried the weight of a lifetime spent in the racing world. Jack. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, but I needed you to know the truth. I was wrong to let you go. Marcus clearly confessed to everything before he died. The information leaks, the frame job, all of it. You were the best mechanic I ever had the privilege to work with, and I failed you when you needed me most. I can't undo the damage to your reputation, but I can tell you that everyone who matters in this business knows you're innocent. You deserve better than what happened to you. Anthony Winters. Jack read the letter twice, then a third time, each word helping to heal wounds he'd carried for nearly a decade. The vindication he'd stopped hoping for had been waiting for him all along, held in trust by a woman who understood the value of truth and redemption. So you see, Sophia said quietly, this isn't charity. This is justice delayed but not denied. And it's a chance for both of us to honor my grandfather's memory by doing something right. Jack looked up from the letter, his eyes bright with emotions he'd kept buried for years. The car meant something special to him, didn't it? And it was his reminder that beautiful things are worth preserving, even when they're broken. Especially when they're broken. Sophia smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes. He used to say that fixing something properly takes patience, skill, and respect for what it was meant to be. Shortcuts might get you running again, but they'll never get you running right. Jack folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. When do we start? We already have, Sophia said. The question is, are you ready to bring that car back to life the way my grandfather would have wanted? Jack looked toward the storage facility, where the Ferrari waited with the patience of a machine that had been built to last generations. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Let's go fix ourselves a Ferrari, he said. 3 months later, Jack stood in his expanded garage, now equipped with proper lifts, professional lighting, and the kind of tools he'd only dreamed of owning during his lean years. The Ferrari Testarossa sat in the center bay, its engine purring with the smooth precision of Italian engineering at its finest. Every component had been restored to factory specifications, or better, every system calibrated to deliver the performance Anthony Winters had fallen in love with decades earlier. Tyler sat on a nearby stool, no longer watching from the sidelines, but actively participating in the work. Sophia had insisted on funding his enrollment in an advanced automotive program, and the boy had thrown himself into learning with the kind of passion that reminded Jack of his own youth. Throttle response looks perfect, Tyler called out, monitoring the diagnostic equipment with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling early in life. Sophia emerged from the car, her business attire replaced by coveralls that bore honest stains from working alongside Jack to complete the restoration. She'd insisted on learning every aspect of the process, claiming she owed it to her grandfather's memory to understand what made his favorite car so special. "It sounds exactly like I remember," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Grandfather used to take me for drives when I was Tyler's age. I can still hear him explaining how each sound meant the engine was happy." Jack wiped his hands on a shop towel and smiled at the sight of the three of them gathered around the completed Ferrari. What had started as a deception and a desperate grab for money had become something none of them had expected, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "There's something else," Sophia said, her tone shifting to something more formal. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Next? This garage, your skills, Tyler's talent? It seems like a waste to limit ourselves to one car." Sophia gestured around the expanded space. "I'd like to propose a partnership. Winters Classic Restoration, specializing in bringing vintage cars back to life the right way. No shortcuts, no compromises, just honest craftsmanship for people who understand quality." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Jack looked around his garage, at the boy who'd become like a son, at the woman who'd given him a chance to reclaim his reputation and his passion. "What about Derek?" Tyler asked, displaying the practical curiosity that made him such a good mechanic in training. Sophia's expression darkened slightly. "Derek learned an expensive lesson about the difference between talking and doing. He's moved to Phoenix, I believe. Something about a fresh start and fewer people who know about his various failures." Jack thought about the man who'd tried to use him as a tool for deception, who'd been willing to compromise Jack's integrity to save his own reputation. Derek had gotten exactly what he'd deserved, the consequences of his own choices. "And the bet?" Jack asked. "The marriage proposal that started all this?" Sophia laughed, a sound like music in the mechanical sanctuary they'd created together. "Well, technically the car is running perfectly, restored by someone with genuine skill and integrity. If I were the kind of person who honored bets made by cheaters, I suppose I'd have to consider Derek's claim." She paused, her eyes finding Jack's. "But I've always preferred men who earn their victories honestly." Tyler looked back and forth between the adults, his young face showing the kind of knowing expression that suggested he understood more about the situation than they gave him credit for. "So are you going to ask her out, Dad? Or are you going to make her do all the work?" Jack felt his face flush, but Sophia just laughed and ruffled Tyler's hair. "Smart kid. I can see where he gets it from." As the afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, illuminating the restored Ferrari in shades of gold and crimson, Jack realized that sometimes the most important repairs weren't mechanical at all. Sometimes fixing what was broken meant having the courage to trust again, to believe that good work would be rewarded, and that integrity was always worth more than the price of compromising it. The Testarossa's engine settled into a perfect idle, ready for whatever roads lay ahead. And for the first time in years, so was Jack Harrison.